Well, first of all, I think it is surprising, given the history of transitions between two presidents, the elected one and the one who's departing. I've never seen an administration work so hard to sabotage so much before the new president can enter office. It's dramatically surprising to me. I mean, I knew there was a certain amount of venality and mendacity, probably on both sides, but this is astonishing. The second thing that's astonishing to me is that no one in Washington is willing to take the Russians seriously. This is very dangerous. We have been insisting from the first moment that hostilities began that the Russians were incompetent, incapable, unable to do much of anything, and we've been surprised at every turn. We claim that we have crossed their various red lines. In fact, Putin really hasn't established very many red lines, at least until this point, with regard to deep strike weapons into Russia. But the Russians have always mastered the situation, defeated whatever was sent against them. And the war, for all intents and purposes, is now over. The Ukrainian army is collapsing. There's nothing left really to put into the field. What's happening on the ground in Russia is very interesting, particularly in eastern Ukraine, because they have 900,000 men in and around Ukraine. But what's most interesting is what's happening right now. What is happening now? Well, first, they're repairing all of their armor, all of their wheeled vehicles. Anything that moves is being repaired. Soldiers are being rotated off the line for hot showers, being given warm food, new uniforms, sleep, rest, refitting with, in many cases, new arms. Enormous quantities of ammunition, missiles, and rockets are being shoved forward right up behind Russian forces in Ukraine. And finally, we're seeing a readiness, I think, in the near future to take the offensive that is ostensibly going to be aimed at crushing whatever remains in Ukraine and putting an end to the war. I think we need to take note of that before we go anywhere else. So the Russians certainly are not defeated. The Russians are not desperate for manpower. There are no North Korean troops on the ground in Ukraine. That's a gargantuan lie, and I think eventually that will go away because they can't find anything to support it, but sadly people keep clinging to it. And then in the midst of all of this, we were warned a few weeks ago, and this is not the first warning, we heard this back in September as well from President Putin, that if Russian cities, Russian homes, Russian installations inside Russia were taken under fire by long-range strike weapons given to the Ukrainians, that there would be consequences. And they lowered the nuclear threshold, making it clear that if it was destructive enough, and they defined destructive enough in terms of overwhelming conventional force or nuclear force used against them in Belarus, Russia, as well as in Ukraine, they reserve the right to use nuclear weapons. But they also said that they have hypersonic missiles, and they do. They've demonstrated this repeatedly. I remember when the first hypersonic missiles were fired, hypersonic meaning several times beyond the speed of sound. Usually we think of hypersonic as at Mach 6, Mach 7. We're now looking at missiles flying at 7,000 to 8,000 miles per hour and probably higher. Now they have multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles. In other words, missiles can dispense dozens of warheads, all precision guided, powered by their own rockets, apparently, to hit multiple targets. These are all breakthrough technologies. These are things that we have been, I want to say, working on or researching and trying to develop for decades. The Russians seem to have been successful. In the midst of all of this, we've decided to ignore it on the grounds that, well, we're right, they're wrong, and they're really not what you think, and they can't keep up, and Russia's a backward country, and we're going to continue to punish them until they break. So all of that is in answer to the first question. The second question, which is about a surprise, is I'm shocked that Trump has said nothing. President Trump said, well, I could end this war in 24 hours. Well, that was never true. Nothing starts or ends in 24 hours. Let's be frank. However, he had said that he wanted peace in the region. I've been waiting for him to stand up and say, look, I don't want this war. I did not start this war. And my interest is in ending this war. And as soon as I am in office, I will take steps to meet with the Russians to discuss this. I will host a conference involving all of Russia, Russia's neighbors, as well as the Russian leadership. And we'll come to an amicable solution if there is one. But we must end this war. Remember that one of the things that he said early on, which I very much appreciated, was he said, I want the killing to stop. Well, what does he want now? He's saying nothing. Yet people who are allegedly going to be working for him, people he's selected for appointment, have been saying things. Waltz, the new national security advisor, shocked President Trump's base and everyone that supported Trump for re-election when he said there's no real daylight between me and Jake Sullivan. We agree on almost everything, and we're going to continue to keep up the pressure. That was shocking and amazing because we didn't vote for that. And then we had this man, Gorka, the radio personality, who's always very hyperbolic, who says he's quoting President Trump directly by insisting that Trump said either the Russians will make peace on our terms or as we tell them and stop this war, or the aid given to Ukraine to this point will look like peanuts compared with what we give them in the future. That doesn't make any sense. So my concern right now is that the Russians have concluded that there are no rational people in Washington, number one. Number two, that nothing anybody in Washington says can be believed. But they have thought that if President Trump were reelected, that he would take a different approach. Now they're concluding that apparently he's not going to do that, which means that this will escalate. And when I say escalate, I'm talking about the use of these hypersonic missiles. And they've selected new target sets, I'm sure. These things can reach the Middle East in 10 or 11 minutes and devastate whatever they do, finally target and destroy. And I think that's something else to understand. The Russians have been trying to develop alternatives to nuclear weapons really since the 70s. Marshal Ogarkov's brain trust, his Soviet general staff that really appreciated the revolution in ISR strike technologies, was looking for an alternative to nuclear weapons because the Russians concluded very accurately and correctly, I think, that nuclear weapons are poisonous. They destroy everything. What's the point of using a nuclear weapon? It doesn't benefit either the winner or the loser. Everybody loses. So this is the penultimate outcome. This is the child that has been birthed over many decades thanks to some breakthroughs in technology. The Russians don't need nuclear weapons to destroy anything. And that is something that they wanted to make clear. And by the way, we can't shoot it down. We can't intercept it. We'll have trouble tracking it. And we can't stop it, which means that you're facing a weapon that is invincible and invulnerable. Yet everyone in Washington buries their heads in the sand and says, it's time to escalate, which makes no sense. And we're hearing nothing from President Trump. I think President Trump should speak, and I hope he sticks with the original intention to end this thing and make it clear he doesn't support what Biden is doing. But again, we had this new national security advisor saying, oh, yes, Jake Sullivan and I are on the same sheet of music. Scary.
Yeah, no, that is very scary. I know many that voted for Trump were very excited about the fact that he immediately got on the phone with Zelensky and Putin. But then you make a good point. Why is he not discussing this? Why isn't he immediately saying, no, not another $24 billion to Ukraine, and Biden needs to stand down. We are in the middle of transition. Quit amplifying this. Do you think there's any worry that he's afraid that they're going to walk him into a booby trap like they did? Oh shoot, I just forgot his name. General Flynn, where they say, "Oh, you're doing official business before you're inaugurated."
No, I don't think so. The Flynn case was very different. The real question is, what does President Trump ultimately stand for? What does he want to accomplish? He has been, on the whole, on record as saying he wants to end this war in Ukraine. Good. He's also said on many occasions that he would like to have better relations with the Russians. Good. All of a sudden, we hear nothing of it. He is actually in a position as the president-elect to simply make it clear. Take a trip downstairs from the second floor or third floor in Mar-a-Lago, walk up to the microphone. There are hundreds of people waiting to hear what he has to say and say, look, I didn't start this. I didn't sign up for this. I want this to end. And I am here to ask President Biden to refrain from any further actions that could jeopardize our attempts to reach an agreement with the Russians in the next term. There's nothing wrong with that. That's completely legitimate. That is not an attack on Biden. That's a simple state of the facts. But that hasn't happened. And so a lot of us are left wondering, where are we headed? Have we all been fooled and bamboozled? Are we actually on the road to another term of irrationality in foreign and defense policy? I don't know.
Okay. Roger Stone had mentioned to me one time that for all the good of Trump, his ability to grab attention, get all of this free publicity, that he was not as good as Ronald Reagan at articulating, here's exactly what I'm going to do, or this rumor is completely false, or here's how we rectify this like ABC approach of what he wants to do. Do you think maybe it just hasn't crossed his mind to make a public statement?
It's hard to know. First of all, everyone that is on the list of appointments or nominations, whichever, should shut up. This is not a time for them to speak for the president. And listening to Waltz and Gorka is very disturbing. The president hasn't said anything. Is the president interested in saying something? Does the president want this to happen? Does he want these people to make what I consider to be very incautious and dangerous, imprudent statements that could lead to catastrophe in the future? Does he think this is part of a game that's being played to mislead his opponents as well as his friends? I don't know. What I do know is this, Steve. Wars destroy presidencies. You go back and look at everybody who went to war, ultimately their presidency was destroyed. People say, well, what about FDR? No, his New Deal died on the battlefields of Western Europe and the Pacific. Now, we can talk about how we got into all of that and whether or not that was good or bad. That's another subject. But the point is, he had a lot of things he wanted to do domestically he never was able to do. The same thing happened to Lyndon Baines Johnson. Vietnam sabotaged virtually everything he undertook in the war on poverty and the Great Society. Now, if you go back to the presidents that sort of assiduously avoided being dragged into conflict, they were far more successful domestically. And of course, Eisenhower, when he becomes president, inherits what for the time was a crushing national debt resulting from the Second World War. So his focus for 8 years was to drive down the debt. In other words, get it under control, restore prosperity. So he could have taken over and he could have gone to Korea and said, we really need to fight this war and defeat everyone. And we could have fought there for the rest of the decade and he would have been destroyed. Instead, he wisely said, no, the American people don't support an open-ended war against China in a place called Manchuria that no one can find on the map. And that's going to cost us 800,000 or 900,000 men in the field. That means we have to double the number of people in the armed forces. No, I'm not going to do that. So what did he do? We got the truce. It was not a perfect outcome by any stretch of the imagination, but it avoided a major war that could have been very destructive to everyone at a point in time when we really couldn't afford to fight it. We need someone to stand up and say, enough of this. We have more important business here at home. Now, President Trump says he wants to secure the border. Great. He says he wants to deport the illegals. However that is going to be done, he hasn't said, and none of his underlings have said anything. That's fine. I would like to hear more about restoring the rule of law inside the United States. I'd like to hear some rational discussion of what happens inside the United States when we cut off the flow of drugs and human trafficking. I don't think people are aware that the drug cartels that we're dealing with in the Caribbean Basin and Mexico are very well represented inside our own country. In other words, they have chapters in every major city and across the country. How are they going to respond to the tremendous loss of income? Oh, I'm sure they'll say, well, I guess the game is up. We'll just pack it up and go home. Doubtful. That we're going to have a fight on our hands. I haven't heard anybody talk in those terms, to think any of this through. Not that they need to share all of this with us right now. But if that's his priority, and if I were president, those things would be my priority right now, not Eastern Ukraine, where we've never had any vital strategic interest of any kind ever, contrary to what Lindsey Graham and the other neocons in office are saying. And by the way, I would bring this thing in the Middle East to a close as quickly as possible because I think Israel's on a suicidal path. I don't see how they can survive all of this. And that's what I think Eisenhower would say. I think that's what any number of other presidents would have said. We're not hearing any of that. We're hearing we're going to have more of the same. Well, if I'm president, I'm going to fight this to the finish in the Middle East. Really? You know, what's your plan to destroy a nation of 100 million in Iran? Good luck. I mean, what's the outcome? What are we trying to achieve? We know we can bomb lots of people. Now, this time around, it may be tougher. We'll probably take losses. We're not bombing hapless people with AK-47s and bed sheets and sandals anymore. We're dealing with sophisticated opponents. But what is it designed to do? You know, please tell us what the objectives are and how this benefits the United States. Remember, President Trump said in his first term repeatedly, what's in it for us? He asked the reasonable question, where's the return on our investment? And he accurately stated there was no return on our investment whatsoever in the Middle East. Everything was a failure. We lost $14 trillion, thousands of good soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines. We destroyed the lives of God knows how many Americans as a result of this. I know too many people that served overseas for years that have been through divorces, that have lost wives and children that come back to nothing. What's the point? Why are we doing this? I would like to hear the old Trump ask the question, what's the return on investment? And it doesn't take very long to figure out there is none. So if there is none, what's your plan, President Trump? And I think he could stand up and I think people would cheer him from Portland, Oregon, all the way to Portland, Maine. If he said, look, I've had it with this. There's no return on any of this for us. We're ending it. We're leaving. We're going to focus here at home. We're going to get control of our borders, find out who's in the country, restore the rule of law, build prosperity. What are we talking about now? Tariffs? How do you impose tariffs on these nations like China? It hasn't hurt Russia. It's certainly not going to hurt China. China's whole, if you look at the direction in which Chinese trade is moving, it's away from us. They can live without us. We're not in the same position as we were 5 years ago. So I'm worried that this becomes a Smoot-Hawley operation if we go down that road. And the armed forces, if we haven't figured it out yet, we need to wake up and understand those are in ruins, badly in need of a major overhaul. This is like a corral full of dying brontosauruses. You know, we don't want any more brontosauruses. We need to breed herds of raptors, if you will. You understand? We've got to change these things. I don't hear anything about that. So we'll have to wait and see. But at the moment, I'm a little concerned.
Okay. Yeah. Hopefully, just with building the transition team, I'm just wondering, like I have contacts that have connection to Trump. I just wonder if those ideas can be floated. I'm just wondering if he's so distracted with so many fires that need his attention that it's just not crossed his mind. But again, we'll give him time because that's all you and I can really do is sit by and see what actually.
Well, surely, Steve, he's got to understand that the direction Biden is moving in Ukraine right now is a path to inevitable confrontation with Russia. And my fear has always been not that the Russians would use nuclear weapons. I don't believe that for a second. And there's no interest that they would have in doing so. My fear has always been our readiness to do that when it became clear that we had nothing else in our arsenal. In other words, when you come up a loser at every turn, what do? Well, you turn to the one thing that you've got that you think is going to change the game. The problem with nuclear weapons is that you use one and you rapidly escalate to the strategic level because everyone is afraid to use it or lose it. So that's my concern right now is surely President Trump understands that the stakes could not be higher. And Russia is stronger than it has been certainly since the 1980s. I mean, very, very powerful. They are ready to fight. We are not. I see no evidence that we're ready to fight. I see no evidence that anybody in the United States, certainly nobody around me, nobody in the East Coast that I know, nobody on the West Coast, nobody that I know in Missouri or Montana or South Dakota or Utah wants to engage in a world war. But that's where we're headed. And people don't seem to get it. You would think these hypersonic missiles would have wakened everybody up, but also look at the quality of the force arrayed against us. Look at the numbers of countries that have joined BRICS and want to join BRICS. There's something like 80, 84 countries waiting in line to join it. The world has changed. We are not adapting. And our only response seems to be to bully, bribe, or bomb. Bully, bribe, bomb. It's a bad way to do business. We don't need to. We got to get out of it. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it.
Okay. Let's switch gears to President Biden is openly taking credit for brokering this ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel. I'm also reading now that China is taking credit and calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Gaza says they want a ceasefire. Who's actually brokering these deals, and will they stick? Or is this just like give everybody 60 days of breathing room and then the battle starts again in January?
Well, you're right to raise that issue because let's face it, most ceasefires in most parts of the world are usually fragile. Easily broken. So that's the first problem. Everyone's intentions may be good, but these things could easily break down. Secondly, is it just a pause in the war? Yes, I think it is. And I think we're getting the pause not because of anything we did or anyone else did. It's because both sides are exhausted. The Israeli Defense Force has been fighting nonstop now for 13 months. I think a lot of their soldiers are exhausted. Their economy is in ruins. We're essentially, keeping them afloat with vast quantities of money. Large numbers of Israelis have left the country. The Israelis would like to get back to normal, but they've poisoned the well with all of this talk about Amalek and everyone who is not them deserves to be destroyed. That I don't think they're going to get very far with that. I think the problem right now is it's temporary, period. And of the two sides, I think Hezbollah can recover a lot quicker than the Israelis can. The Israeli manpower pool is very limited, unless, of course, they can successfully entangle us. And I think that has been Mr. Netanyahu's goal from the beginning. And at this point in time, I think he said, let's wait for President Trump. I think everyone is waiting for President Trump in some fashion. Even the Russians, though they admittedly have very low expectations based on their experience, they're waiting to see. I think Iran is waiting to see. So what does this mean? We go into a major war in February, March, April? Could be. I mean, you can have a ceasefire, you can stop killing, but you can do nothing to solve the essential problem. And I don't see any evidence that the fundamental problem for Israel, at least as Israel sees it and has wanted to dispose of it, is solved.
Okay. You and I talked just briefly before hitting record. Things are very quiet right now between the United States and Iran. Are those embers of war still burning beneath the surface? Do you see the United States-Iran conflict still potentially being the storm of the century?
Well, the storm of the century involves more than Iran. My concern is that, yes, the fires are burning that are full of hostility and anger and hatred for Iran. We have adopted Israel's perspectives, Israel's views, and we see Israel's interests as identical to ours. Now, I don't agree with that, but it doesn't make any difference what I think or what most Americans think. That's what the ruling political elite, the ruling class in Washington, D.C. thinks. They also think that they have the military power to dominate and preserve their so-called post-war liberal international order, which I think is already on the skids and fragmenting anyway. But they think that they can hammer everybody back into line with our military power. I do not. So to answer your question, things are quiet, but don't be misled. And you have to look at the people that surround the president, the one leaving and the one coming in. I think we have to finally believe what people tell us. And what Waltz is telling us, what Gorka is telling us, and potentially others from whom we haven't heard yet. I'm sure Senator Rubio, if he ends up in the State Department, which I suspect he will, there's no daylight between him and his predecessor Blinken in terms of what our interests are and what we want to see happen in the Middle East. So if that's true, I think everything right now is temporary. Everything is a temporary pause, if you will. In some cases, because of mutual exhaustion, which is true in southern Lebanon, it's true in Israel. And in other cases, because everyone is waiting to find out if their worst fears are realized and nothing of substance changes, or that they'll be surprised by the appearance of a Renaissance man in the White House. We would certainly welcome that, but we haven't seen much evidence for it lately.
Okay. Yeah, I like this Gorka guy. I've listened to him a few times, but on one podcast, he mentioned that he completely supports Ukraine, unlike others in Washington, D.C., because he sees the United States as being France in helping the United States break free of England. So he sees Ukraine as the United States, Russia is England, and then the United States is France, and we're going to intervene and give the money necessary. I mean, he basically made that analogy. But again, one of the things that encouraged me the most about Trump was on that CNN town hall. Who do you want to win, Ukraine or Russia? And he said, I just want the killing to stop. I don't know that Gorka and others, I think that maybe at this point, they're beyond feeling when it comes to death. It's just part of the day.
It's very easy for people like that have no personal experience of war and combat to be very bellicose. Remember, it's always somebody else's son who is blown to pieces, or somebody else's daughter who is killed. It's not one of theirs. There's an enormous gap between the ruling political class and the rest of the population, let's face it. Now, we probably will see a few veterans, but then you got to be careful of what veteran really means and start digging through where were you, what did you actually do? No, we can say all work has dignity, and somebody took the trouble to serve, that's good. But as a famous British general said after World War II, the numbers of people who are veterans of direct fire combat is a pretty exclusive club. It really is. And if you're not in that club, making sweeping statements about, we can go and we can do this, that, or the next thing, and bomb them into the Stone Age, and our soldiers can kill them at a 1-to-6 ratio and all sort of business. Sounds great, but when you try to put theory into practice, it doesn't turn out that way. And the American people, once again, are not consulted. If anything, I think the American people have been sedated. They're sort of sedated consumers being herded in whatever direction Washington wants to go. Now, that's the other aspect that could change. And I'm not a financial analyst, don't claim to be an expert, although I've taken precautions because I fear the worst. I think we are on the verge of tough times economically and financially in the United States. We'll see what the new administration does. But the idea that we can continue to spend recklessly and add trillions more to the overwhelming sovereign national debt and expect countries to hold our debt, to buy our debt, I think is very unrealistic. And it doesn't take much to upset the apple cart when the apple cart is very fragile. If Saudi Arabia, China, Japan, any number of countries decide to essentially dump the treasury bonds that are now worthless, bought 20 years ago, 15 years ago at a very low interest rate, that could have a terrible impact here at home. And the bond market is something everybody is watching, but only a few people really talk about it. And that's not the only thing. We haven't even talked about the banks. And the banking sector, based upon, it depends on who you want to listen to, whether you're talking about James Ricards or Groman or Kyle Bass or any number of people. The banking system is not healthy. In fact, I'm being told they're 8 times worse off now than they were in 2008. That's pretty bad. Everything is sort of held together by paper clips and rubber bands. One band snaps and the whole thing falls apart. That's why, I've argued, and that's why I would urge any incoming president right now, whether it was Donald Trump or anybody else, disengage from these disasters overseas. There's no return on our investment. Seek some sort of equilibrium. Get out of it, which is what Eisenhower did in Korea. Get back to the United States and let's fix what's wrong here. It's going to take us a decade to crawl out from under the massive public and private debt that we face. It's not going to happen overnight, but we ought to be worried about our people, their living standards, their prosperity, their health. That's where we should be. I just don't hear it very often.
Okay. There's the old cartoon of a devil sitting on one shoulder, an angel on the other.
I thought that was the movie Animal House now.
Does Trump have enough, for lack of a better word, angels on his shoulder? I know Elon is against war. Vivek is against war. J.D. Vance is against war. RFK Jr., Tulsi. Are these people enough to help Trump fulfill his mission of being a peacetime president? Or do we have so many warmongers and people whose $1 million lifestyles depend on war? Are their voices going to be able to override these other people?
That's that's an important question. I think whatever you do, you've got to go back and examine who the people are that provided money to Donald Trump to win the White House. Donors matter. Washington is donor-occupied territory. The people calling the shots, I think Elon Musk spoke about it the other day. He talked about the top 100 people. And I think he was talking to Tucker Carlson, and then they giggled over the fact that there was quite an overlap between the top 100 people calling the shots in Washington, people that you'd recognize the names if you saw them, but you rarely see them, but they're actually shaping policy, that their names are also on the Epstein Island frequent flyer list. So this is a very corrupt situation. You have the same thing, I would argue, in the Senate and the House. Lots of Epstein frequent flyers, lots of people engaged in all sorts of behaviors that are repulsive, repugnant to any normal average American. Most of it is hidden from view. But these people are calling the shots. And so you wonder how much influence in certain areas Donald Trump will really have. And I don't know that. I don't know how much freedom of maneuver he has. Because some people are going to say, listen, you can't do that. That's impossible. What? Well, what are you talking about? Well, let's look at the pharmaceutical industry. That's very powerful. You cannot, we're going to ban all advertisement on television for pharmaceuticals. Do you think the pharmaceutical industry will allow that to happen? It seems unlikely to me. So there's a major fight. Now you're trying to fight the pharmaceutical industry. In the meantime, say you decide, well, we've gone far enough in the Middle East. We need to rein in these Israelis. Well, wait a minute. There's another lobby that represents billions of dollars that's saying, no, that can't happen. This must continue. In other words, what are the areas that he can really change and shape and mold? I don't have an easy answer to that question. But we need to understand that the people that help get you elected matter.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. It's not like he's caught in one Venn diagram. He's caught in dozens and dozens of Venn diagrams. He's going to be pulled in many directions. Final question. I appreciate you coming on. Your thoughts on Trump's pick for the border czar, Tom Homan. He seems like a bulldog. I hope he will be a bulldog. Do you think he will be able to fulfill his mission of shutting down the border and going after the criminals and getting them out? Or is he also going to be caught in a bunch of Venn diagrams of people that want to keep NGO funding and, sanctuary city protection and all of this?
Well, first of all, Tom Homan is a very decent, honorable man. I've known him off and on over several years. He's very competent. He's very sincere. What Tom Homan says is what he believes. You're not dealing with a duplicitous character in any sense of the word. I have no problems with Tom Homan. I do have problems with making him the so-called border czar. What is that? What are his authorities under the law? What's his budget? Meantime, you have this. In the meantime, you got this person named Kristi Noem, a governor from South Dakota, who is going to run Department of Homeland Security. Well, Department of Homeland Security is one of the first agencies I'd get rid of. We don't need it. It's a carbuncle on the anal cavity of Washington, D.C. Let's dump it, and then let's give people like Homan in charge of something. Put him in charge of something that's meaningful. What are we doing on the border? What about the Federal Border Patrol? I've been very concerned for a long time. We don't pay them enough. They don't have good retirement and pension backing. One of the things I remember years ago when I was in Germany, people said, as a piece of advice to soldiers, don't try to bribe the German police. If you do, they'll arrest you immediately. That's a federal crime. And they said, why? I said, well, you can't bribe a German policeman. Why can't you bribe him? Well, first of all, it takes a lot of time, training, investment to get the man to the position where he can become a policeman or woman, whatever it is. Once they're there, they have a very fine pension system that no one would ever want to put at risk, including medical benefits, dental benefits, and so forth, tax benefits. We don't do that for the Border Patrol. And how can the average Border Patrolman resist, a giant wad of cash, maybe 300,000 or 400,000 greenbacks that he would never see in his entire life, no matter how well he did his job, from the drug cartels to let more illegals in the country who are probably mules. Some consist of children being sold into the worst kind of slavery you can imagine. And some are just people trying to get out of one place and get into another. We have to fix that. That's why you've got to put the Army on the border. We've had the U.S. Army on the Mexican border from 1846 until 1948. And we've been through several massive deportations. That's what people don't know. Herbert Hoover deported an estimated 9 million people to Mexico after the stock market crashed, because he was afraid that they would be attacked by Americans who wanted their jobs. You've heard this refrain, oh, they're doing jobs Americans won't do. Well, plunge the country into poverty. You'd be surprised what Americans are willing to do for money, right? So he understood that, and they were carted off. The Army had a role in that. And then subsequently, FDR deported 3.1 million. At one point, another million down the line. Harry Truman, a couple of million. Eisenhower, 1.5 million. My point is, this is not a new problem. Porous borders. You're stopping criminality. You're stopping corruption. and you're stopping people from entering the country that we don't want or need. Now, we need to understand something. And I say this to people, they look at me strangely because everybody's angry right now. They want, let's deport all these people. I said, first of all, most of these people that came were invited by Biden and his administration. So before we treat them as criminals we need to sort through this. And I would like to see a plan to do that. I haven't seen it. I think it needs to happen. And then I do think we're going to have to move several million out, but we have to have a system in place that at least says, look, you're leaving voluntarily. You want to obey the law. You're taking everything with you. You want to come back in the future. We'll take your name down. You did not commit any crimes. You had a job. You did this. When our situation is more stable, we'll call you. We'll bring you back. There's nothing wrong with that. On the other hand, we absolutely have to go after everybody who refuses to leave, who's not here legally. And we're going to find that many of them are hardened criminals. And this is not going to be an easy fight. And then you're going to have people that, for any kinds of different reasons, are going to fight this, even though it's in the interest of preserving the country and its society. It's an existential question for America right now, in my judgment. If we don't enforce our laws, we have no laws, we have no borders, we have no country. So it's existential. It's much more important than what's happening in eastern Ukraine. That's not our affair. What happens there really does not affect us. It's not going to affect us unless we continue to bully, bomb, bribe against the Russians. It's not going to work. For them, Ukraine, which is probably one of the most corrupt places in the world, it's effectively an organized crime state, is not just a danger because NATO decided to make it a platform for attack against us. It's because this organized crime state interacts over borders with drugs, illegal human trafficking, you name it. There's no one in charge. This is a catastrophe for Russia. Russia views Ukraine in many of the same ways as we view Mexico. Mexico's an organized crime state. I laugh when people say, well, we'll work with the Mexican government. What's that? The Mexican government controls a tiny little federal zone. The drug cartels control the place. So what do you expect to accomplish? I'm not advocating we intervene down there and invade the place at all. Far from it. I think that would be a disaster. We're not going to fix anything if we do that. But we need to secure our borders. We need to clean up what's going wrong here inside the United States, and we need to be forceful. I wish somebody would talk in those terms again. But everybody is still diverted by this business in the Middle East that could turn into another global conflict. And we have to understand that behaving the way we have towards Russia and Ukraine is going to have an effect on Russia and its relationship with Iran, with Turkey, with Saudi Arabia, the Emirates. All these countries have turned against Israel.
Yeah.
So what are we trying to do? Do we want to preserve Israel? I certainly do. I would like to see it survive. I think we put it on a suicidal path. It put itself there, and it's insisted that we support it. I think it's a disaster for them, for us. So we need to find a way out of those things overseas because the problems here are far more daunting, in my view. Anyway, Steve.
Yeah,
that's what I think.
Yeah, I know you got to run off to your next meeting. I'm going to put a direct link to Our Country, Our Choice, as well as your X, so that people can follow you. Thank you so much for your service. Thank you for continuing to be a voice of common sense. And I hope you and your family have a great Thanksgiving.
My best to you and everyone listening. Happy Thanksgiving. Thanks.
Thanks for watching.